California has stood as a city on the hill, as a beacon of hope for people from across the country and around the world, promising that if you come here, you can better yourself and take part in building the future. And we're losing that when we become a trust fund society. California is nothing short of the greatest economic miracle in modern history. And it's due to the successes of these past generations that allowed California to be this engine of economic and social dynamism. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the California Future Society podcast. Before I dive into this solo episode, I have to start with some housekeeping, a personal update. It's a good thing. However, I am pausing the podcast for the time being. The reason is my wife and I are having a kid. We are having our second child, doing our part to uphold California's population. But I know how demanding it is, having been around the block the first time. And I run my own business. I do this podcast myself. I know what it takes to consistently put out episodes, and I don't want to see a dramatic drop-off in quality. So as a result, I'm going to be taking a temporary pause, kind of putting a bow on this stretch of first episodes, wrapping it as if it were its first season, we'll call it. And it's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed this podcast. I came into it with a wide range of goals. There are some just personal goals of wanting to be able to be more articulate on camera, to be a better interviewer, and it's been fun seeing myself improve. I also want to expand my network and talk and speak with and interview a lot of the people who I really respect and whose writing, whose thinking I really admire. I've achieved that as well. It's also been beneficial for me personally. I've made new connections, built new relationships, even brought in new business by having a podcast. So even though we haven't broken the internet with download numbers, it's been just a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed it, and I found it very intellectually fulfilling. So I'll give you updates on when I'm back. I'm not going to put a hard date on it as we adjust to this new reality, but wanted to give that update to all of you who regularly listen. I really appreciate everyone who's been along with the journey so far. Okay, intro's over. It's time to dive into the heart of it. And this is the idea of California as a trust fund society. This idea has emerged over time. You might have caught on to it if you've listened closely to all of the episodes. It's an idea that I've been kicking around in the rock tumbler of my mind, thinking about it in the shower or on walks as I reflect on different episodes that I've had with different guests. And this is my attempt as I wrap up this first batch of episodes to make sense of where we are as a state and make sense of how we're simultaneously one of the largest economies in the world, one of the most successful states in the nation, while it also feels like on a lot of policy fronts and on various cultural fronts as well, it feels like sometimes we're shooting ourselves in the foot, getting in our own way with policies that make it harder to build, harder to afford a home, harder to operate as a state, and to build towards a more vibrant, dynamic future. So this is the idea of California as a trust fund society. I feel like everyone knows what a trust fund is, but I'll err on the side of clarity, right? A trust fund, it's someone who inherited their wealth, right? Who didn't necessarily build the wealth themselves. It was previous generations, either their parents or grandparents or before, who created the wealth, and they are then living off the benefits of those wealth. And it typically is used in a, I wouldn't say derogatory, but with negative connotations, right? Oftentimes for people who, people would say they're born with a silver spoon. They're out of touch with the economic realities of daily life, right? I think about Arrested Development, Lucille Bluth, the family that is rich in Newport Beach. They lose their money. And in one of the first episodes, she says, it's a banana, Michael. What can it cost? $20, right? It's just woefully out of touch, right? Anyone who's working class, middle class, they know how much a banana costs. They know how much a gallon of gas costs because it's the difference between them making their budget or not making their budget. But when you have an incredible inheritance, when you're living off wealth that was created before you arrived, it's very easy to lose touch with the economic realities of your decisions and what it takes to build towards the future. So my argument is that California as a state, that we are living off of the benefits and successes of the past, of previous generations of investment, and that we've lost touch with what it takes to thrive and to grow and to be dynamic as a state if we want to continue being California in the future. Before we dive into the specifics on California, I think it's interesting just to talk about human nature, right? We see this time and time again across culture for individuals and societies, the idea that the generation who builds the wealth, when they pass it along, that it's hard to maintain it. And before going into this episode, I didn't realize this, but there's phrases that capture this concept around the world. The English have a phrase of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. In Scotland, apparently, that people say the father buys, the son builds, the grandchild sells, and his son begs. The Chinese apparently have a phrasing saying that wealth never survives 3 generations. And in Mexico, a phrase that translates to the father is a warehouseman, the son a gentleman, the grandson a beggar. There's a SoCal version of this, on the evolution of wealth. This is something that I heard one of my parents' friends say at a party. They said our parents were farmers so that we could be engineers, so that our kids could be artists. Which, yeah, I just love that. For if you know the trajectory of the Southern California economy, we've talked about that in other episodes. That phrase, that aphorism captures the Southern California experience very well. But I put all this out to say that this is something that we recognize, right? That wealth builds and falls, and we see the rise and fall of empires, the rise and fall of individuals, and the rise and fall of dynasties. And we also see this in companies too, right? Once companies grow, they very easily and quickly become stagnant. It's hard for them to move and be nimble and as aggressive as their competitors. They face, the innovator's dilemma, where to embrace new technology and new ways of doing things oftentimes would upset the status quo. And so therefore they're unwilling to fully commit to the new thing. And this is why companies come and go. So for this analogy to hold for California, it means that previous generations of Californians have created the wealth and the vibrancy and the dynamic society that we are kind of living off. We're living off the tailwinds. We're kind of coasting off the momentum that was previously created. And if you see some of my previous videos, for example, the one on the evolution of the California dream, I talk about how California is nothing short of the greatest economic miracle in American history. And there's so many factors. I won't go into depth on all of them, but there's everything from California's abundant land filled with beauty and natural resources ranging from gold to farmland to oil to ports. We have this perfect climate. We have this relative isolation that allowed our society to develop in its own way. And then if you zoom in more recently to California's history, right, looking at just the post-war boom of World War II through today, we had all these other factors that contributed to society as we know it today. We have this concentration of some of the most innovative companies and world-class talent, this influx of people, of the strivers and the dreamers and the doers from across America and around the world flocking to California to try and build a brighter future. We had abundant and cheap housing. We talked about this with in the episode with Virginia Postrel, talking about how California was affordable. You could come here from anywhere and find a place to live. Specifically, Southern California is what we talked about in her episode. There's also a culture and a willingness to build. I think about, Jerry Brown's father, Pat Brown, that era of when there was the higher education master plan and the California aqueduct, and we were adding hundreds of thousands of people and millions of people to our state during his time as governor. During this time, we also had this incredible influx of defense spending pouring into aerospace and our fledgling tech industry, both in Southern California and up in Silicon Valley, which led to really the crown jewel of California's wealth that we still experience today, and that's the tech industry, which I'll come back to that later. It's a key part of kind of later arguments talking about where our economy stands today. But this is our inheritance, right? This is the notion of the California dream, of California as instant transformation, as a place where you can better yourself. And it's due to the successes of these past generations that allowed California to be this engine of economic and social dynamism that created the mythos around California that we still live out today. Okay, but so if that's our inheritance, then where are we today? If for this trust fund mentality, this trust fund society argument to hold up, there has to be a pivot, right? There has to be a shift from the decisions of before that led to productive growth and dynamism to stagnation. And I think we've talked about these in a lot of different episodes, right? We talked about this in the built environment, how we've made it impossible, really challenging to build things like the homes we need. Right? We talked about this with Nolan of Caliemby or Bill Fulton, how the anti-growth movement of California, in response to the tremendous growth that the state experienced, led to the layering on of all these different regimes and regulations and local issues that have made it hard to build the housing that we need. There's the actual policies, and then there's also the culture around it. And now we find ourselves as a state, the state that used to build world-changing aqueducts and kind of the world-leading infrastructure. Now we can't even build a high-speed rail, right? One of the worst boondoggles of contemporary history. We're having to spend over $1 million a unit on affordable housing. And we see states like Texas building more renewable energy than us, especially for things like solar, which is unthinkable for California being the state that invested more in that technology than any other when it was first coming out. In addition to making it harder to build in the built environment, we've also made it harder to operate businesses. We spoke about this a lot with Casey Handmer. We were talking about how anyone who's building in the real world, how it's really, really challenging in California. And there's a lot of these different rankings in terms of states and how they are as business climates. And ones that focus on business costs or taxation, they often rank California, if not dead last, then pretty close to it. And this comes up anecdotally, right? I was just at a conference 2 weeks ago where a senior policy leader from a major tech company, it was on data centers, and the question came up of, okay, some neighborhoods, some regions, they don't like these data centers being built there. And so why don't you just build these data centers in the middle of nowhere? And the senior tech executive said, well, as proof that we actually do have to build these data centers near our customers, California is the second largest data center hub in the nation. And quote, no one does business in California if they can avoid it. Basically saying if we didn't have this overwhelming demand from our customers to locate the data centers near them, then we wouldn't even bother trying to build in California because everyone knows that it's really tough to build there. And this wasn't just a conference of business leaders. This was a conference of policymakers from across the political spectrum, from across the country, and they all, kind of chuckled in response. And of course, there's also just the companies in recent headlines, right? Bed Bath & Beyond announcing that they're not going to be building here. In-N-Out, a company that is identified with Southern California, announced that while they're still going to be headquartered here, they're going to be focusing a lot of their growth and their expansion in Tennessee. And then you have companies like Oracle, HP, Chevron, and others that have announced that they are leaving California. So there's very specific reasons for this, and you can get into the policy or economic decisions around any single one of those factors that I just listed out. But if you abstract up a level, if you zoom out a little bit, I think they all boil down to this trust fund mentality, this belief that we as a state are immune from the forces of history and that we will not face consequences for making it harder to build. That's why we have things like the anti-growth movement, because we believe that we don't need to grow, we don't need to build, and we can still remain dynamic. We're willing to oppose business even as we enjoy the luxuries of being one of the wealthiest societies on earth. And we don't take building seriously, and we're willing to tolerate wasteful spending programs or building programs that don't achieve their goal because we trust that our budgets are ultimately going to get balanced out or bailed out from the next wave of tech IPOs. At the end of the day, we do not fully feel the pain from negative decisions in the way that other states might because we live out of this deficit mentality. We're like a trust fund kid who lives beyond their means, but isn't shielded from the pain of going into debt, from the pain of not being able to afford rent or knowing what they're going to do for their economic future because they have such a rich inheritance fueling them, pushing them forward. And so I think the best case study to explain this is our economy, is our economic output. And this is the core puzzle that got me thinking about this concept. Because anytime you catch yourself or talking about how California is a difficult place to operate business and people saying those grumblings like that tech executive said, at some point pretty quickly someone will come back and say, well, if they're so hostile to business and California is so backwards, then how is California the fourth largest economy in the world? Right? It's a really valid question, right? If California is so toxic for businesses, then how is it that we as a state have a $4.1 trillion GDP, fourth largest in the world, larger than Japan if we were our own nation state? And so that just got me thinking because I've heard the governor say that, I've heard other politicians say that, and I started thinking about these numbers. So California is obviously the largest state in the nation. So at first I thought, okay, well let's break this down a little bit. Are we just bigger than other states and that's why our economy is so big? Like maybe is America just, relatively wealthier and we happen to be the largest state in America and that's what makes us so stupendous? Well, no, we're not just bigger, but we also are more productive. Just as a good case study, right? California and Texas, always kind of the two biggest alternative case studies. So California's GDP is around $4.1 trillion with a population of 39 million. So that comes out to around $105,000 per capita. Texas's GDP, on the other hand, is about $2.7 trillion with a population of 30 million. That's about a $90,000 per capita, about a $15,000 per capita difference. And for reference, the US average is around like 85,000. So really, tech is the difference. So I found a report from the California Foundation for Commerce and Education. It's a think tank associated with the State Chamber of Commerce. And they estimate that combining direct and indirect output, the tech sector in California accounts for about 30% of the state's economy and only about 20% of the jobs. That was in 2024. So not only do they account for 30% of the state's economy, it's also about 30% of the state's tax revenue. So this is like back of the envelope math, napkin math. But if those tech workers disappeared overnight, if Thanos snapped his fingers but was exclusively targeting people in black t-shirts or in tech campuses up in Silicon Valley, we would basically be about the same as Texas, right? So if we lost about 20% of our population, or tech is about 20% of the jobs. Let's assume that led to 20% of the population being evaporated and 30% of our economy disappearing. That would bring California down to around 32 million people and a $2.9 trillion economy, which is the 90K per capita number that Texas is at. So, Texas has a lot going for it, as does California beyond tech. So I don't want to oversimplify and argue that California is simply tech. But tech is the difference, economically speaking, of what makes California so spectacular and unique and productive. There's even cases in recent years where tech IPOs and the success of the tech industry has helped bail out California's economy. We thought that we might be facing a worse deficit or a deficit to begin with. And then because NVIDIA or some of their stock rips and all these people selling their shares and paying the capital gains tax within the state, that the state budget ends up in a much better place than anticipated and projected. And so what's interesting is while tech is our state's crown jewel, economically speaking, at the same time that is true, I work in tech policy for a lot of my day job. Of all the states, California is the most hostile towards tech in terms of the types of policies that we propose and pass. There's cases like AI policy, where last year California proposed SB 1047 on frontier models, and that went far beyond where any other state was at the time. And there's a lot of other bills at stake this session. If you're in that world, this is going to be dominating your news cycles for the next month or two as California's legislative session comes to an end this year. There's also been instances where, the California Assembly and legislature has passed rules trying to require humans in driverless trucks that have been vetoed by Newsom. There's even the former Assembly member, Lorena Gonzalez, who's now the head of labor, so one of the most powerful political forces in the state, famously got into a spat with Elon Musk, publicly tweeting at him, telling him to F off, which he claims is part of the reason that he left the state. Obviously, Elon's star has fallen a lot since that happened a few years ago, but just shows you kind of the tenor of the relationship between labor and between a lot of the political leaders in California and tech. And so, you can debate the merits of those specific bills or whether or not they're worthwhile. There's legitimate public policy debates on how do you balance consumer protections and business interests. And I'm not weighing in on that here. But just at a bigger picture, stepping back, I think it's crazy that California is leading the charge against its biggest industry relative to other states, right? Like, can you imagine Texas leading the charge against the industry, the energy industry, right? That'd be unthinkable. Or even, California has other industries like Hollywood, or we're actively subsidizing them through tax credits, while meanwhile we're going after tech. And I think there's obviously some political factors around it, particularly under the new administration, and tech has become more affiliated with the right. But I also think it's because there's this durability to the tech industry, that we have this belief and this understanding that, for example, unlike Hollywood, we feel like we can do whatever we want and tech is still going to stay in California. Right? There's a lot of people who have tried to understand and study why is tech in California. This is a pretty well-studied topic in the field of economic development because so many other states, so many other countries have wanted to jumpstart their own tech economy. Silicon Valley is the envy of the world because it is so productive. It is the modern gold rush, and we have captured it here in California. And you can go into all the different factors of why California is the center of the tech universe. But long story short, the easiest way to explain it today of why we have a tech industry is because we currently have a tech industry. It's so incredibly difficult to start a tech ecosystem and to have the talent and the capital and the culture and the environment. But once you start it, the network effects are incredibly durable once they're formed. And we saw this during COVID, right? As everything went remote and the tech industry was work from home, everyone thought, well, maybe this is the opportunity now, right? Maybe this is when Austin or Miami or New York are going to become alternative tech hubs, but it just didn't really happen, especially now with the AI waves. San Francisco, Silicon Valley is still the best place in the world to build cutting-edge AI tools and software, and LA is still one of the best places in the world to start hardware startups. We have inherited this industry And now we believe we can more or less do whatever we want and not really pay the price. It's almost like oil-rich countries, right? There's the notion of the resource curse or the paradox of plenty, that we as a state, because we have such a rich inheritance that is durable, that we can be irresponsible, but we're going to be bailed out. We're going to continue to have the checks roll in. And so therefore we can behave in a way that other states simply can't, because if they did that, if they were increasingly hostile or raised prices towards industry, that they would pay a really tangible price. So again, tech in the economy, that's just one case study. This goes beyond tech. I think it genuinely, as a state, we believe that we can create a hostile business environment, that we can refuse to build housing, that we can actively drive out some of the most productive companies in the state and not pay any consequences. Because for now, it's kind of true. But in any complex, slow-moving system, the bill eventually becomes due. Right? As an analogy, Europe, like just look at Europe, especially Western Europe, which for centuries has been kind of since the Industrial Revolution, right, has been an economic powerhouse, a leader in the world. They are currently suffering from the signs of stagnation after refusing to build, and they're starting to see the negative consequences. There's a lot of different factors here, but just a few to highlight, right? It's like the fact that Europe doesn't really have a major tech industry, so they're not able to participate in these booms. This is something that came up in this Draghi report. Mario Draghi published this report. He's a European leader talking about how Europe's regulatory regime, even as it tries to pass the world's leading tech regulations, how one of the factors that its regulatory regime is choking off its ability to innovate and to compete with American tech companies or Chinese tech companies. Europe is also increasingly economically stagnant, culturally stagnant. It's growing at about 1% a year economically. It has an aging population that's shrinking in many countries. And this is, in some arguments, kind of one of the greatest stretches of stagnation economically that the continent has experienced since the Industrial Revolution. There's also examples, one that's been going viral on X recently, is how Europe is so not only just energy poor, they have really high energy prices, but they also just refuse to build air conditioning in a lot of their cities. And they actually lose more people each year to heat waves than we do to gun violence in all of America, which that stat blew my mind. I had to double check it to make sure it was true, and it's true. So far, most of the examples I've given are on, the economy and politics, because that's kind of the world I live in, the waters I swim in. But this goes beyond just economics or GDP numbers. A trust fund society is one that fundamentally violates the promise that California was built on, one of promise of instant transformation, of being a place where you can come and better your life, right? This is the entire episode I did on the California dream, that California has stood as a city on the hill, as a beacon of hope for people from across the country and around the world, promising that if you come here, you can better yourself and take part in building the future. And we're losing that when we become a trust fund society. A trust fund society is one where the only people who are able to live there and to thrive are the people who already have wealth, and the have-nots are not welcome. And we've already been seeing this. This is already showing up in the data. This is not some far off future idea, right? If you look at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California, there's this great think tank that studies the state. They have all this data showing that we've been losing residents to other states for more than 2 decades. And we have particularly been losing low and middle income families since 2010 and before, even though it was only really recently around COVID that when the overall state population numbers stalled out or started to shrink, that people started freaking out. But if you've been lower class or middle class, working class rather, you've known, those families understand and know that California is no longer the place of opportunity. There's also the fact that when you adjust for cost of living, California has the highest poverty rate in the nation, which we simply just do not talk about enough. I think that is crazy, that California is the wealthiest society on earth, yet we have the highest poverty rate. This is part of the reason why housing is something I care so much about and why I've talked about it so much on this podcast. Right? That's one of the instances, the examples that is clearest and the most tangible for people, especially if you live in the coastal cities or in one of the major cities in California. You know that, unless you're making like $300,000 a year, or you literally have a trust fund, or your family already owns a home and is able to help you out, you can't buy a home. It is so challenging just to get by in the state. This is why I care so much about the future of California, because a trust fund society is one that is static, that embraces the status quo, that loses the ability to push the future forward and to be a dynamic place where not only can people come and materially benefit, but California can play the role that it has historically, where it serves as the hotbed of innovation for the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And the current status quo, this decision making of living off the gains of the past and this psychology and this mentality, it's not sustainable. At some point, you pay the consequences for your decision. And the absurd, extreme wealth that California has grown accustomed to is the product of a commitment to investing in our future, a commitment to growth, a commitment and a willingness to build the state. And if we lose that, well, that's how we lose California and we become just average. California has shown that we've been able to be above average, that we've been able to be spectacular throughout history, and we shouldn't lose that. And anyways, I'm getting hyped up. I'm getting amped. I can feel myself repeating myself and starting to shout at the camera. I have a baby napping next door, so I'm going to lower the temperature a bit and land the plane here. There's a lot that I can talk about. But I just think more than anything, the reason I've started this podcast, the reason I talk about this, the reason I care about this and talk to other people is because I want the future of California to be dynamic. I want it to be great. I want us to continue living out the role that the state has played historically. And I don't want to see us stagnate and decline. I think it's that simple. And who knows? Maybe the status quo is tenable. Maybe I'm playing the role of Chicken Little. It's possible that things can continue going this way, and that the benefits of the past, the network effects of tech and other factors and other elements of our economy and our society are so durable that even in the face of mediocre or bad governance, that we can continue to thrive. But I just don't think that's true. I just think that is ignorant of most of history. I think that at some point the pain will grow so great that we are forced to change. And get back to the basics, get back to the fundamentals of what it takes to build towards the future. And that's something that gets me really, really excited. I'm going to end there. Thank you for all of you who are listening. Thank you for all of you who have listened so far to the podcast in the past episodes. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, this has been a very life-giving, enjoyable, and fun process for me. And I appreciate every one of you. So without further ado, take care, and I'll see you in the future.